Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the conference for the media investors and analysts on the TAURON Group's Q1 2023 financial results. The hosts of today's meeting are Mr. Paweł Szczeszek, the President of the Management Board of TAURON Polska Energia, and Mr. Krzysztof Surma, the Vice President of the Management Board for Finance, the CFO. Good morning. My name is Łukasz Zimow. I'm the press spokesman of TAURON Polska Energia. Ladies and gentlemen, traditionally the presentation will be conducted in Polish, along with a simultaneous interpreting into English. Outside of this broadcast, you can also listen in to today's conference using the teleconference mode of operation. I'd like to invite you already to ask questions using the form available on the broadcast website. That's the only way to ask questions. If you have questions, please use the form. Mr. President, the floor is yours. Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, it's a great pleasure to welcome you to the conference on the financial results of TAURON Group for the first quarter of 2023. In my part of the presentation, I will discuss the overall financial situation of the group, the most important highlights of the first few months of this year, and the CAPEX projects. On the other hand, Mr. President Krzysztof Surma, CFO, will present the macroeconomic situation and will discuss the financial results in the first quarter of this year, broken down into the individual lines of business. Let's move on now to the second slide, please. On this slide, we are presenting the financial results and the operating data achieved by TAURON Group in the first 3 months of this year. The EBITDA generated by TAURON was higher by 14% year-on-year, and it was more than 2.2 billion PLN. On the other hand, net profit topped 1 billion PLN, which represents a 15% increase year-on-year. In the reported period, we spent 780 million PLN in CAPEX. This is 28% more than in the same period of last year. The net debt to EBITDA ratio came in at the end of this quarter at 3.2. With respect to the volume of electricity distributed, we can see a downward trend, 4% year-on-year. This is the result of a economic slowdown. The electricity supply and the heat production were almost flat versus last year. The sales revenue in the first quarter of 2023 came in at 13.5 billion PLN, and it was 38% higher than in the same period of last year, mainly due to the higher electricity prices, higher gas prices, and the higher prices of CO2 emission allowances, which was the result of the market situation. In parallel, we also posted a significant increase of operating expenses. On the next slide, we are presenting the highlights of the first few months of 2023. 2023 for TAURON Group will be a breakthrough turning point for TAURON, during which there will be structural changes will be implemented. First of all, we started this year without the 3 coal mines, which on the 31st of December last year, we divested to the state treasury. Secondly, we also have a process of transferring the coal-fired generation unit to the National Agency for Energy Security. We implemented all of the planned reorganization activities, including the integration of the assets within the TAURON Wytwarzanie subsidiary, and we are ready to spin them off into NABE, into the National Agency for Energy Security. There is advanced works underway related to the details of the transaction. Thanks to the spinning off of both mining and coal-fired generation assets, the perception of our group on the financial markets, capital markets, will significantly change, which means a much easier access to the funds for the expansion of the group. In parallel, we are systematically expanding our low and zero emission sources. In the first quarter, we started working on Gamów and Mierzyn, 2 wind farms, and in Warblewo in May, the commencement of the next wind farm, these projects are a confirmation of a steadfast approach, green turn of TAURON. We are planning to complete those transactions in the third quarter of next year. And this way, we will increase our capacity by more than 120 megawatts. It's also worth adding that we are currently analyzing several wind projects as well as photovoltaic projects. On March 31st, we completed the mediation in front of the arbitration court at the Legal Council of the Republic of Poland related to the contract for the construction of a 910 megawatt unit in Jaworzno. And we signed with the general contractor a settlement agreement defining the method of completing this contract and making mutual settlements related thereto. According to the provisions of the agreement, the TAURON Wytwarzanie received 240 million PLN that was paid out of a performance bond for the contract, and this way the settlement agreement came into force. Currently, the completion of the works on the Jaworzno unit is up to TAURON Wytwarzanie subsidiary. We started working on the optimization, the tune-up of the unit, aimed at preparing it for the acceptance test with the PSC, the TSO. Also, at the beginning of the year, we signed agreements with a Polish mining group for the production needs of the generation units owned by TAURON Capital Group, TAURON Wytwarzanie, TAURON Ciepło subsidiaries. With the earlier contracts with TAURON Wydobycie, JSW and Węglokoks, we secured our requirements for coal for the 2023 as well as for the subsequent years. Now let's move on to the slide that presents the capital expenditures of our group. Ladies and gentlemen, the capex incurred by TAURON Group in the first quarter of 2023 came in at 780 million PLN, and they were more than 28% higher than in the same period of last year. The increase of the capex was reported by all of the operating segments of our group. Traditionally, the biggest amount, almost 600 million, was allocated to the distribution segment, and the majority of that was spent on installing new grid connections as well as modernization and replacements of the grid assets. For the whole 2023, we plan to spend on the expansion of our grid 2.4 billion PLN, which will represent more than half of this year's capex of our group. This will be the biggest financial stream allocated to the distribution segment over the last few years. Let me emphasize that the successful transition of the power sector is dependent upon the expansion and modernization of the distribution grid towards the so-called smart grids. Without the restructuring or refurbishing of our grid, no matter how much electricity we produce, the system will not work efficiently. The renewable segment came in second as far as the capex is concerned, to build the 6 wind farms and the PV farms and the modernization of the hydraulic power plants. We spent 75 million PLN in this first quarter of this year. Similar funds were allocated to the generation segment. Mainly it was spent on the replacement and refurbishment works, as well as investment in the new capacity construction and the connecting of the new facilities to the heat network. Let's move on to the financial part of the presentation. So let me hand over the floor to Mr. Vice President Krzysztof Surma. Thank you very much. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. The first part, I will discuss the macroeconomic situation and the key data that have an impact upon the operating activities of our group. As far as the macroeconomic situation is concerned, in the first quarter of this year, we were dealing for the first time since the pandemic time with a decline of the GDP quarter over quarter, year on year. This drop could have been predicted already based on the PMI indexes that have been below 50, the level of 50 for a long time. An important comment, those PMIs continue to be at the level that indicates the economic slowdown, not so much the recovery. This economic slowdown, the weakening of economic sentiment, has a significant impact upon the consumption of electricity in Poland. In the first quarter, we are dealing with a 3.5% decline of electricity consumption if we compare quarter over quarter. At the same time, this decline of consumption has a significant impact upon the production. Last year, we were dealing with a situation which was a bit different than this year. First of all, we had a growth of the consumption, and secondly, the prices of the neighboring markets were markedly higher than in Poland, and thus Poland was an exporter of electricity to the neighboring countries. In this quarter of the first quarter of this year, in fact, we are dealing with a completely different situation. Not only we are dealing with a decline of electricity consumption in Poland, but on the other hand, also the prices in the neighboring countries were lower than in Poland, and thus Poland became an importer of electricity. This led to major changes in the energy production mix. General decline came in at 7% and was mainly based or allocated to the coal-fired as well as lignite-fired generation units. The only growth that we had observed was the increase of electricity generated from the renewable energy sources, and here a large number of renewable sources commissioned last year means that our generation from this line of business is getting higher and higher. And secondly, which is also not surprising, the generation from the gas-fired units went up significantly. The prices of gas worldwide dropped significantly, which had an immediate impact upon the profitability of the generation from these units. Last year, those units were producing less because of limited constrained access to gas and the higher prices. This year, we had a completely different situation. The gas prices dropped significantly both worldwide in Europe and in Poland. The generation from these sources has increased substantially, and therefore the entire generation mix markedly changed year over year, which had an impact upon the results of our group, which I will expand upon when discussing the individual segments. When we look at the revenue, as it was mentioned in the first part of the presentation, we've observed a significant increase of revenue year over year in the region of around 40%. This increase was mainly due to the price of electricity contracted already last year, because today's market prices are at a different level, but the prices contracted for this year are significantly higher year over year, and this leads to the greatest increase of revenue. Also, the rates went up both in the heat distribution and the supply segment, and let us remember that as that revenue went up, the costs of operating business operations of the group operating expenses went up, which I will elaborate on later. Net profit, this result came in at around 1 billion PLN. We have a quarter here where there was no impairment charges, therefore no write-downs, so the net profit directly reflects the operational situation of our group. With respect to EBITDA itself, an important issue which we also will be discussing in detail when we look at the individual segments, the comparable EBITDA year over year went up by around 9%. Comparable, which means adjusted by stripping out the one-off impacts and effects, and the results, the effects that are due to their value non-typical, because last year in 2022 we had a typical one-off effect, namely we reorganized, as a matter of fact, the CO2 emission allowances, which we had a surplus due to the fact that the Nowe Jaworzno unit was shut down. These carbon credits were transferred to other units, and the result on this transaction was recorded in 2022. It was a one-off event. However, we're dealing in the first quarter of this year with non-typical events, partially one-off, but non-typical mainly due to their magnitude. The first event is a matter of settling the regulatory account due to the fact that the volumes in 2021 were substantially higher. The distributed electricity volumes were significantly higher than the ones that we reported in would have been under the tariff. So part of that surplus, according to the regulatory regime, was deposited in the regulatory account, and what is the deviation, volumetric deviation in the distribution segment is settled, is accounted for in the N+2 year. A similar situation will take place this year. We are dealing with a reverse situation, but with respect to the second one-off event, the balance of the upward adjustment of the grid losses. Here, I must say, it's a non-typical event. I will be elaborating on that on the slide when I discuss the distribution segment. Here, we'd like to emphasize that the recurring EBITDA, the repeatable EBITDA, is 9% higher if you compare quarter over quarter. Now let's move on to the individual segments. Here all the segments have reported positive earnings from the operations, both on the EBITDA and EBIT level. We have positive results. Traditionally, our key segment was the distribution segment. In the distribution, we posted the highest EBITDA result. The second biggest result was generated by the generation segment. Here, for the first time, we are showing the results without the mining segment, which I mentioned at the very beginning. The coal mines we sold, we divested on the last day of December of 2022. So, first time we are showing our results without the coal mining segment. Let's move on to the EBITDA comparison quarter over quarter. Here we can see that the two segments had the biggest impact upon those results. The first one, a significant increase in the distribution line of business, more than 400 million, and we have, on the other hand, the generation result by more than 400 million was worse. But let us remember that these both events are either one-off events, or they are burdened with one-off events, or the non-typical events, and I will expand on that when I discuss individual segments. And now let's move on to the first key segment for our group, namely the distribution segment. And this key element that had an impact upon the earnings of this segment, especially if we compare quarter over quarter, is the balance of the upward adjustment of the grid losses. As I mentioned before, this is the element that was recurring in the successive years, in the previous years. However, never it came in at such a high level, at such a magnitude. So this balance was tops several dozen million in the previous year, so it was not so clearly shown in the results of the distribution segment. But this year, due to the very big price difference between 2022 and 2023, we were dealing with such a non-typical event, and that's why such a high amount, more than 600 million, as the value of this balance of upward adjustment. This difference is due to the price difference. The higher this difference on the plus side, the higher the one-off effect, and that's what we are dealing with this quarter. However, if in the subsequent years the market price will be falling versus the price of the current year, then this effect will be acting in the other way around. So looking at what is happening today on the market and seeing that the electricity prices, average electricity prices are dropping versus declining versus the level last year, one may expect that in the following period, so at the end of this year and beginning of next year, we will be dealing with a reverse effect. So as a matter of fact, the reversal of some of this increase, of some of this growth that we are showing in the first quarter of 2023. This is an element which is a non-cash element, non-cash item, and this is not so much a one-off event, but a non-typical event due to its magnitude. As far as other elements that have an impact upon the results of distribution, the one that I already mentioned is the volume. The volume, both in terms of the settlement of the regulatory account. As I mentioned, this regulatory account is getting credited in a positively at times when the volume of electricity distributed is higher than the one assumed under the tariff, and when it is accounted for settled in the N plus 2 years and the other way around, then this year we're dealing with an actual decline of a volume, a decline versus what we have under our tariff, and this effect also will be reversed, but in the N plus 2 years. So one may say that these effects have a direct impact upon the results in the given quarter, but from the distribution model point of view, they are neutral over a medium term. The last element that is worth emphasizing here in the distribution, well, in spite of a significant increase of the distribution rate, after we strip out the increasing cost of a transmission service and covering the costs of having covered the balancing difference at the operating level, the results of the distribution segment quarter over quarter are weaker due to the fact that despite such a strong increase of rate, this increase was not able to cover both growing costs, such as the external service costs and the labor costs. That's all regarding the key issues related to the distribution segment. Let us move on to the... But wait, a few words about the indicators, quality indicators. If we look at those parameters, the key distribution quality parameters, they basically were complied with. We do not expect any significant negative impact upon the tariff in the subsequent years. Besides the works between the PTP and the president of ERO about the model and the quality parameters, maybe in the subsequent years the quality parameters will also be slightly changed, the ones that the president of the Energy Regulatory Office indicates. Moving on to the renewables segment, here it's a non-typical situation. The EBITDA year over year, or quarter of last year versus the first quarter of this year, is practically flat. However, here we have been dealing with certain events that allowed this to happen. As far as the volume is concerned, the volume of electricity is concerned, generated from the renewable sources, it is higher year over year. Let us remember that in this segment we are not showing the biomass-fired generation sources. As far as the hydrological conditions were better quarter over quarter, the wind conditions were a bit worse quarter over quarter, but let's remember that we commissioned last year 2 wind farms, the Majewo and the Piotrków farm. Therefore, the volume of electricity generated was a bit higher. In addition, we were dealing with the decline of price of the green certificates and the reduction of production. As I mentioned, the wind conditions were a bit worse year over year, and as a result, on the wind farms covered by the up to now support system, we generated a slightly smaller quantity of green certificates. The results of the segment were improved by a one-off event. We finished a court dispute, a court litigation that we acquired as we along with the acquisition of the Juventus Group 2019 of Juventus assets, so it was a positive resolution of this case, so it had a positive impact upon the results of the segment. Let's move on to the generation segment. Here, first of all, one needs to emphasize a stable operation of the Jaworzno unit. Thanks to the stable operation of this unit in the first quarter of this year, let us remember that in the first quarter of last year, the unit didn't work, so we didn't have to buy back the electricity. And if they did take place, it only takes place due to the market situation that was favorable to such moves. Therefore, although on the market we are dealing with a falling CDS, so the margin on generation on the coal-fired units is declining due to the increase of the price of coal and the increase of carbon credit prices. So the lack of a buyback operations or potential buybacks whenever the market situation supports such moves meant that the generally marginal electricity year over year is positive. The second element that I already mentioned at the very beginning, which had a major impact upon the earnings of the segment, is the CO2 emission allowances. As a matter of fact, those CO2 emission allowances, it was a surplus of the allowances which were not used due to the lack of a production of in 2021 of energy NGT. And if we approach this as a typical one-off event, if we stripped those results out of the results of 2022, the first quarter, one might say then that the result of generation segment year over year is flat. In the first quarter of this year, the margin on heat generation was not fully covered by the appropriate increase of the tariffs, and thus this margin declined year over year by more than 60 million PLN. It was also due to the result of increase of coal prices and the increase of the carbon credit prices. Let's move on to the supply segment. Here, this segment also, it's worth emphasizing that finally this segment arrived at a certain stabilization of market prices. The stabilization is very important due to the ability to cover in-house costs. It's not expensive. Last year we're dealing with a very strong growth of prices on the market, and the need to buy more electricity in order to secure an open position prevented, practically made it impossible to cover all the full cost, justified costs, and the full cost of the supply segment. And therefore, last year, this segment generated a negative result. This year, thanks to this achieved stabilization of prices on the market, it is possible to have the cost of operating of this company to have it fully covered. Last year, the tariff G not fully covered the justified cost of the company. This year, the tariff G covers this cost. It's also worth adding that the supply subsidiary, in terms of EBITDA, generated in the first quarter 145 million PLN, generated only one-third of that result. For the balance was affected very positively by the commercial activities, trading activities at the TAURON Polska Energia level, and was very good results as far as the scale of the operations of a Czech subsidiary. Additionally, those results were also supported by the TAURON New Technologies subsidiary, mainly in the lighting area. It's also worth emphasizing here, due to the centralized trading model in our group, the key part of charge that we are dealing with due to the introduced acts of law at the end of last year, the majority of charges is paid for in this segment. Out of 300 million, that 290 million is related to the supply segment. In terms of issues related to the debt and financing, here, of course, we are dealing with a significant increase of the debt, which you can see in the results of our group. The net debt to debt ratio went up significantly to 3.2, but it's also worth mentioning that the debt level and leverage level and the net debt to EBITDA ratio was to a large part related to the settlement of the CO2 emission allowances and the significant worsening of net working capital, substantial increase of accounts receivable and increase of inventories. These accounts receivable are also related to the compensations fund, and as a matter of fact, in the subsequent quarters we are expecting a gradual decline of debt and also the decline of net debt to EBITDA ratio. So this quarter we're dealing with a very high level of this net debt to EBITDA ratio, but in subsequent quarters this leverage ratio should decline. And let me add that the group has an adequate level of liquidity and secured source of financing, so the group didn't face any problems meeting its financial obligations. That's all regarding the financial data of individual segments, and let's move on to the questions and answer sessions. Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, a few questions we have already received. Let me repeat that if you want to ask a question, please use a form that's available on the broadcast website. According to the Polish Association of Utility Scale Heat Generation Plants, the expenditures in order to comply with Fit for 45 will come in at 276 and 400 million PLN. According to the company, will these costs be fully passed on or included in covered by the tariff? Well, today practically another coordination congress was finished in Kazimierz Dolny of Vistula River, organized by the Polish Association of Utility Scale Heat Generation Plants. It's difficult to imagine that such enormous costs could be fully included or covered by the heat tariff. That would lead to an excessive increase of price of heat for the consumers. Will be using various funds, among other the Just Transition Fund, in order to have smallest cost to charge our final consumers with the smallest part of that cost. Another question, what's the situation now regarding the structure of electricity after the wholesale electricity price at the TAURON Group? What portion of electricity is sold via the exchange? What portion is sold intra-group, and what portion is sold via the OTC contracts? Well, I'll try to answer. Let us remember that the trading obligation, exchange trading obligation, was abolished at the end of last year. So some of the electricity was sold last year, still under contracts for this year, was sold via the exchange. Some of the contracts we already concluded directly. Of course, we are using this option, and we conclude those contracts directly between us, namely between the generating subsidiary of TAURON and TAURON's subsidiary, but we are not disclosing, of course, the percentage, what percentage we sell via exchange and which percentage we sell via under OTC contracts. You know very well that we are exposed on the sell side, so we sell much more electricity than we generate, so we have the ability to fully transfer electricity within the group, so secure the electricity generated by the group by the sale contracts outside. But of course, we are observing the situation on the market, the liquidity, and here the group is basically on the other side. So it's looking at liquidity so as to buy electricity on the market for the supply needs, for the needs to deliver electricity to its customers. And another question, the question from Business Alert: what are the TAURON's expectations related to NABE? NABE, what are the planned capex in renewables this year? What are the challenges related to the financing thereof? How do you see the potential of CCS? Well, let me answer this question. Ladies and gentlemen, TAURON Group is a great supporter of NABE project, National Energy for Energy Security. We are strongly interested in that because the power system is so designed in such a way that, in a way, the power plants of TAURON are the final piece of the system. So the stability and the predictability of contracting of coal is much more difficult in case of other power plants. Therefore, we hope that, in accordance with the statements of Mr. Prime Minister, this project will be launched as soon as possible. Regarding the CCS potential, this type of technology probably will be more interesting for NABE, although ourselves, because the conventional generation is retained by us, which will require some modernization in the heat line of business. And we are looking at the technologies that are used to capture carbon dioxide, various types of technologies, including CCS. So we haven't made any final decision yet which technology, if we do apply, which technology we will choose. Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, and that's the last questions today, unless something comes up yet. What is the exact mechanism of the arising of more than 600 million PLN of upward adjustment of grid losses due to the price in the distribution line? Why is not this amount reflected in the supply segment as a loss, since the distribution segment buys only it's from this segment? So will it be reversed somehow, the 600 million PLN reversed in the subsequent quarters? I tried to answer this question during my presentation, but let's walk it over it again. The amount itself is, as I said, is a consequence of very substantial price change year over year. And that's why it was a non-typical event. In the previous years, we are also dealing with this mechanism. It's a model that's been in place for a number of years in the distribution segment. We never dealt with such a large increase year over year. Moving on to the answer whether will anything change in the subsequent quarters, let me say yes. Generally, we are looking at what's happening on the market, as I mentioned, and once this price year over year, the average price year over year is declining, then we will be dealing with a partial reversal of this amount. What amount is difficult to answer at this point in time, depending on what will be average price for this year. Probably not with the whole one. Will not be returning probably to the prices of 2021. So partially it will be reversed. It will be reversed probably at the end of this year and the beginning of next year. In terms of supply segment, it's alone supply segment. There are various models of buying this electricity. You can buy intra-group. You can buy this electricity outside of a group. Let us remember that we are dealing with the unbundling issue here. So the groups approach this issue in different ways. Meanwhile, the supply segments apply various mechanisms, various models to price this item. The mechanism that we have in our group, it's more referring in the supply segment to the electricity purchased on the market and the electricity delivered to the distribution segment, and the valuation, the pricing of this electricity is reflected then in the results of the segments. Therefore, it's not an automatic reflection of results from one segment in another segment. Although we know that various groups apply different models, we have observed the financial reports of other utility groups, and we can see based on these reports that each group has a bit different model of reflecting this result between the distribution and the supply segments. Even in the distribution itself, there are different models. We are just guessing, looking at the results reported by the other utility groups. During this answer, we got another question. In terms of transferring the generation assets to NABE, what is the current status of the relocation of some of the financing of the group to NABE and the timetable for the transfer of the assets? Let me answer this question as well. At the moment, we are finalizing the works regarding NABE itself. We completed practically all internal works, preparing those assets for the transfer. We completed the due diligence reports. Now, practically, the valuations of these assets are being finalized. The works are underway on the delivering the materials to the banks. While if we talk about the financing itself, let us remember that we are talking about the transfer of the financing, intra-group financing, to NABE and a potential repayment thereof. The discussions are still regarding this topic. They will be finalized once the final approvals of banks' credit committees are received. In terms of a timetable for the transfer, we do hope that according to what the Prime Minister mentioned, we do hope that over the next few weeks we will complete the works related to the valuations, the works related to obtaining the approvals of the credit committees of the banks, and the works related to the negotiations of the provisions of the SPA agreements are being finalized. So we do hope that over the next few weeks we'll be able to at least the first agreement regarding the transfer of those assets will be able to conclude. Probably that one will include some some precedent conditions. Prices about the coal prices, world price of coal in 2023 in terms of the RR decline to 15 PLN per gigajoule. That is the company the company secured its prices for the coming year. The prices of the coal are not, of course, open. It's not open data, are confidential, but we are responding during the year in case of strong fluctuations of coal prices, and we renegotiate it we renegotiate those prices if there is can you please provide comparable adjusted EBITDA from the distribution segment for first quarter 22 with the adjustment for the same items as like for first quarter 2023? In terms of comparable results of the distribution segment year over year, I would like to refer to slide number 6 of the presentation. That's where we are showing those one-off events and non-typical events. They are fully applicable to the distribution segment. So one may say that the result of the distribution segment should be adjusted by about 550 million PLN. And thus, if we move to the slide number 9 of the presentation, so from the level 1.265, we should strip out 550 million PLN. Then we would come in, we would arrive at a very flat result year over year. Now the question, where is the problem with the NABE project now? Is the lack of political will or the financial and legal problem, or do you need a notification of European Commission? Has the application been submitted? Does the company know the valuation of the assets for the needs of this transaction? There are no problems regarding the NABE issue. Regarding the political will, there is political will to go ahead with this project. So we do expect that according to the earlier announcement, I mentioned it before, this project will soon be launched, but notification of the European Union Commission is not required for the NABE project. Ladies and gentlemen, having refreshed my screen, it turns out that was the last question that the President answered. Thank you very much for meeting with us. Already today, I'd like to invite you to the next meeting that we'll be hosting directly after publishing the report for the first half of 2023. And we will notify you about the date of the conference in a traditional way. Thank you very much for this meeting and have a nice day.